everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today, Solidarity Friday. Took a few weeks off, Kyle and I doing shows together with some guest episodes there. Hope that was enjoyable for you. We needed the break. I got a few days off in Arizona, thank God.
Nice.
Because now it's 6 degrees Fahrenheit today here. So glad to get a little bit of warmth in my bones before everything goes away.
Chilly Breckenridge.
Oh man, yeah. And cool, man. So you and I had been communicating a little bit about this philosophy topic, and I wanted to bring it up here in the podcast because it's kind of weird, right? Like this whole, what kicked it off? I was watching this Harvard School of World Religions talk, like they're doing a full year series on psychedelics and the future of religion. And I watched this talk and I was like, this is really challenging for me to sit through, but also like really informative because I'm getting like a lot more worldviews. And one of the most impactful things I heard from one of these folks was, these things were initially mystical, like in a lot of ways. Right. It wasn't necessarily about healing, not necessarily about healing. In some cases it is true, yes. But it's more about like, how are we communicating with this living world around us, right? Like engaging in that and then having this extraordinary mystical experience that like the unity states. And there's a lot of particulars that go into what is mystical. And, like it's amazing that psychedelics are healing all these kind of intractable diseases at, hopefully a price that's going to be lesser than current treatments. And yeah, like it's amazing. But what we're seeing often is that a lot of these states are getting minimized. Like are we reducing the mystical to the medical? And what does that mean? And why should we be doing that? And it's great that people are getting therapy. We should keep working on that. But like, what does it mean philosophically that we're kind of like reducing this thing? And the other point, Kyle, that you had was about like, how do we know certain things? Like, what is good? Right. Like, this is like a wacky, fundamental question. Like, what is the good? What is good?
Yeah.
And it's like, and you and I are kind of working through some ethical stuff right now for a paper. And what is even ethics? Like, like we're reading Aristotle because he was the first one to really write about it in the Western tradition. So
to live the good life. And what does that mean?
So let's back up to something that I think I can speak to better. But, we've been talking about the Euthyphro, Plato's Euthyphro, and the good. Mm-hmm. And this person was going to try to get his father imprisoned for how he treated one of his, slaves. Obviously in Greece there were slaves, so that's a problem, but they're not around really anymore. So, kind of resolved itself after a few thousand years. But, this idea that this person knew what was good was the main focus of the thing, because he was like a, super preacher of sorts. Like, look at me, I'm super holy. But in the Greek world with multiple gods, it's not so clear as it might be for monotheists.
Right.
How do you want to dig into this? Like the idea that something is holy and good for Zeus and it's not holy and good for Neptune or like Hades or whoever. Like there's a plurality of authority out there. Like how do you choose to please one of them over the others? And what does that mean if you're making one angry?
Yeah, and I think this kind of came up because you mentioned the religious event that you attended with Harvard and then podcast with Brian Maurescu and talking about ancient Greek. But we're also doing this psychedelic and philosophy class. And some people were just, we're interested on like, how does Plato relate to the psychedelic experience? And our last class was on Plato's Euthyphro. And something that kind of popped in my head was, the whole dialogue is about somebody killing a slave and thinking like, is that pious? And so it's all about piety. And let me grab a definition here for pious for those. I had to look it up when I started.
Yeah, it's like kind of being holy. Like how do you please God and all that kind of stuff.
Having or showing a dutiful spirit of reverence for God or the earnest wish to fulfill religious obligations. So, relating to religious devotion, sacred rather than secular, having or showing appropriate respect or regard for parents or others. And so, thinking about, what is pious and what is piety to, is killing somebody if Zeus said so, and is that good, right? Thinking about like that sacrifice.
Divine command theory is what that's called in the modern world. It's a wacky one.
And so I just kept thinking during this class, it's like, oh, how does this tie to psychedelics? Well, I was like, well, what if ayahuasca tells you to do something? And since we tend to put plant spirits up on a pedestal at times, then, is it always good that ayahuasca told me to do this thing? And how do you show up? Even if it feels, say, bad, I guess, do you follow through with that, right? To show respect to the plant. Well, the plant told me this, so I should listen to that because, then I'm practicing piety, So it's an interesting question about discernment, I think. Like that whole play really brought up discernment. How do you discern some of these messages that are coming through? Just because Zeus or the plant spirit told you to do something, does it make it good? And should you necessarily act on that or participate in whatever that thing is?
Right. And kind of in this like panpsychist worldview, like if something's giving you messages, like there's a lot of things out there that could be giving you messages and communicating to you, like the spirit of water generally, or like a river or cannabis, or like, or the spirit of Xanax or something. Like that's, in this weird modern world, like that thing's got a lot of use case and a lot of, if we're doing the panpsychist thing.
Right.
Like, and people who are addicted to benzodiazepines often like get themselves into big trouble. Like they blacked out for 3 days and did all sorts of bad, quote unquote bad stuff they wish they didn't do, put it that way, in their normal sober state. So it's like, how do we frame this? What do we do here? Like, the MDMA told me I should start off a poly relationship with my wife of 20 years.
Right.
Like, all right, we're changing the way we do this now, sweetheart. Like without any kind of like questioning, is this going to be harmful to my partner? Or, there's a lot of weird questions here.
Yeah.
And, like the term we were exploring this earlier today. And the thing I was like saying is, okay, what makes a God? Like, what's the difference between a spirit and a God? And how do you even go there? Like in this kind of weird world where we can have interactions with these things pretty regularly, like we should understand what we're doing here and how to frame these things. And they are going to challenge your worldviews. But like, is the thing that makes a God just the spirit getting enough power that it like there's a certain kind of God threshold? Or is it like, this spirit becomes an authority for a people and then, everybody just kind of falls in line behind that, and
right.
For Apollo was like the head god for Troy, where Iliad and the Odyssey kind of like, that was the main waypoint in the story. And like, what does it mean that they were transgressing against Apollo? Like at Apollo, a major city for Apollo, where everybody was kind of like in service of Apollo. And yeah, like in a lot of people's minds, it's really easy. Like, okay, spirits don't exist. Only things that we can like hold and measure exist. My argument is we haven't really put in enough time to measure spirits yet to really say that with any kind of authority, but people would argue with me on that.
Or do we even have the technology to measure spirit, right? Do we understand what that concept is enough to create a technology to figure out what it is and how to measure that?
Like I'd say, your training in shamanism, plenty of people's training in shamanism, plus a few other things like, the Western magical tradition, like Kabbalah, like that, like those things investigated systematically, I think could yield some very helpful fruit that we could then work with philosophically and scientifically.
Right.
But because they're kind of locked up in religion, science doesn't want to look at it, and kind of vice versa. Like they don't want to reveal their soft underbelly just to the sharp knife of science, which is kind of, rough. But, Tibetan Buddhists are going under MRIs pretty regularly. People on psychedelics are going under MRIs pretty regularly. So, we're making progress. And I guess I'm not trying to shit on anything. It's more so like, let's maybe ask bigger questions.
Yeah, or just how to, I guess, ask questions to learn how to discern information. I think that was like my biggest takeaway. And, one of the things I often just try to emphasize and talk about is this idea of discernment within the psychedelic realm, world, the messages that you're getting. And I was just talking to somebody about all this, just talking about like scientific tools, right? Like coming from the somatic world and whatnot, like our bodies, I think sometimes we dismiss that and maybe you might call that a little woo-woo, but how is your body an actual instrument that can help you understand maybe what's going on? I mean, it's firing a bunch of signals all the time, right? I mean, information is just coming in and we have to try to make sense of it. And, is it an appropriate instrument to try to learn how to discern actually the information that's coming in?
Yeah.
Could we finally tune that? I don't know.
Yeah. Like, I think it's done best in community, in an egalitarian type community where, there's not an Octavio Rettig to like interpret your experience for you.
Right.
Let's problem solve this together. Maybe like I'm going to have my personal, experience and it means what it means to me. But like as a community, like you can have a lot more depth and a lot more minds on a topic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Checks and balances are important.
Right. Runaway abuse issues around here. But yeah. So Brian Pace from Symposia in his, what is it called? Lucy in the Sky with Nazis or something. He had this really important point that I thought was possibly one of the more important points in the piece, citing Robert Carhart Harris's study, I think from 2016, about psychedelic users having a reduction in authoritarian attitudes. Do you remember that one?
I briefly.
Yeah. Brian Pace's point was this is 24 people or so, half of whom didn't take psychedelics. So it's really like such a small sample size. It might have even been like 14 total. Like it was such a small sample size, and the amount of press this got was a really, shocking thing. Because like, we can say, oh, that's interesting. And yeah, we should do more research, but we can't universalize
right
from that.
I guess the government tried to during the 60s, right?
Yeah. All psychedelic users are the devil. Deserve to go to jail and get shot and stuff. So, yeah. So anyway, like the point I think I wanted to bring up around philosophy was that there's a lot more questions we need to be asking. Like this idea that medicalization is the one use. It's kind of shallow. And it to me, it doesn't hold that much water when like the amount of benefit we could get from psychedelics beyond medicine, like treating acutely ill people, is, it's extraordinary if harnessed properly.
Right. Well, I think that's just the paradigm that we're in, right? I remember reading a study about just religion and how, religion is just decreasing people's, faith. I mean, people, I guess,
spiritual but not religious, that idea.
Yeah, exactly.
That number of people is growing like crazy, and psychedelics are kind of like turning into that church for a lot of people.
Right.
Psychedelics in their local community and, whatever Reddit forum they're on or whatever, But
I mean, it's an interesting thing, right? Psychologizing these spiritual or mystical experiences and reducing it to something else. Like say if I had an experience, I don't know, like a spirit entity. And then I could be like, well, what part of that is you? Or could that be your mother? Could that be a manifestation of your mother? Or that's some sort of past life trauma. And so it's interesting, right? I think a lot of the experience is abstract to some degree.
Right.
But I think it comes back to like, how are we making meaning out of it? And how are we leaving people, I guess, like, teaching people how to make their own meaning out of it versus saying like, this is what's going on for you. And we're going to like put this in a box of it's always trauma related. Well, I don't know. Maybe it's not, maybe it's just really weird mystical stuff and you're interacting with some sort of energy that you've never been exposed to before. And that's just what it is.
Right. Like the way this is my personal interpretation. I'm not telling anybody to take this on because I don't have enough facts to really back it up or anything. But the way I like to look at this is there are quote unquote non-human entities that interact with us on occasion, not always. And like our experience of them is, it's a interactive process. It's us plus them equals this new synthetic whole, like our kind of like, new creation together with that experience. Like the same way, like, I'm doing my day over here, you're doing your day over there. We come on Zoom and it's a whole different experience, like a third thing. Like,
right.
And it's some sort of interaction there. On what levels that works, it's, there's a lot of spiritual books you can read on this topic. Right. And, you could go as ad nauseum, but really it's about you trying to figure it out for you. And like what you were talking about there about like getting psychologized, that DoseNation Final 10 series, that I was unable to finish. I don't know if you finished it, but
I did.
Kent, very often was calling all of these states psychotic.
Yeah.
Which by
dreams even psychotic, which I thought was really interesting. I was like, huh?
I don't think he's a psychologist or a therapist or anything. Neither am I. Well, I might start calling myself a psychologist at a certain point, but we'll see when I cross that bridge. Certainly not a clinical one. But anyway, the idea that all of these things are psychotic and therefore bad, that was a really problematic talk track that he had through that whole Final 10 series. Mm-hmm. And I found it really challenging because that's not at all how I conceive of these things.
Well, it could be really dangerous. I mean, if we're thinking about the episodes that we did with Will Hall, when you're able to put a label on that, you can also put somebody down and lock them up, right? What if it's just a very powerful experience and it's only going to last like a few days or a week? And maybe if you had a safe container and a different narrative around that without labeling it as psychotic or schizophrenic versus kind of like the psychiatric model, trying to have a safe place in a psychiatric hospital with medication, suppressing the experience, and then putting that diagnostic label on somebody, could that be actually more dangerous at times, right?
I think yes. I absolutely think yes. So, we've got to question our deep-seated assumptions about what was that book? There was The Politics of Experience. Was that Fritz Perls?
No, that was Artie Lang.
And then there was this other book I put in the Facebook group yesterday that Lenny kind of pointed us to. Julie Holland even commented on the thread saying it was a really important book for her education and becoming a better psychiatrist about is mental health political more so than anything else? Is
it Thomas Zaz?
Exactly. Yeah, I think he's Czech. Thomas Zaz, SZACZ or something like that. Apparently a classic in psychiatry, critiquing psychiatry. Mm-hmm. And, people just assume okay, cool, we got a label for this thing, PTSD. Is it a real thing? To what degree is it a real thing? Are you doomed for the rest of your life if you get a PTSD diagnosis? The answer is no. But, it's a big deal. It's helpful to have diagnostic categories, but I think we're taking the diagnostic categories a little too seriously and making them a little too real. A diagnostic category is not as real as a glass of water in your hand, right?
Right.
One's real concrete, one's real abstract. Both are helpful at times. Both could be harmful, depending on what you do with the glass.
Right.
So this is where philosophy comes in, man, right? This isn't psychiatry, lecturer at Columbia, saying this is why. It's no, this is philosophy asking questions about big things.
Yeah.
And we could transition to capital here. I really appreciate Symposia's efforts around this corporadelic topic. I'm just not 100% sold that we can't use capitalism for good. I've seen capitalism be used for good. Not all capitalism is created equal either. We've got this triple bottom line thing. We've got these B Corps.
But what is capitalism? I guess what's the definition there?
Right. It depends on where we want to go with it, right? It's using capital to expand capital. It's our prevailing ideology. It's everything is marketplace is kind of the way people critique it now. It's neoliberalism, everything should be privatized, commodified.
Right.
From the governments shouldn't collectivize to provide services to their people. It should all be done in the private sector is essentially what neoliberalism is talking about. But capitalism could be three different things, a gazillion different things. But you made, you grew some apples and you sold them at the market. That's capitalism. You organized 300 people into this group and, you work together to sell, software, hardware, whatever. Or the more abstract end, like Johnson & Johnson doing all sorts of insanity, from really great medical innovations to just weird intellectual property plays esketamine or what's the trade name?
Spravato.
Yeah. So we've got to look at all this, from different landscapes, and who's to say, well, I get so one of their more important critiques or comments at Symposia that I remember from a while back was something along the lines of what resources are required to keep somebody in an ICU for a week, and how many lives could you save using those same resources in a third world country like Congo or something? Or like how many people are literally in slavery trying to mine these rare earth minerals that are required for computers and certain hardware that is saving lives elsewhere?
Right.
You know, that critique is great and all. Like that's more academic, I think, but it's important to keep in mind. But like, you know, Symposia spending a lot of this time with these critiques when they could probably be saving hundreds of lives overseas for starving people. So it's like, you know, we could too. Like this is something that we can universalize. Like you're doing something, and instead of focusing your efforts on some sort of like post-Christian humanitarian end, you know, feeding people, make sure they don't die from stupid things like starvation, you know, that kind of stuff. Like that's a philosophical bias and orientation. And to not understand that that's a philosophical orientation, I think is a problem.
Did you happen, I know you mentioned briefly that you were kind of listening to the recent James Jesso podcast about capitalism, and I was wondering if there was anything that kind of stood out there for you. I know you said you only maybe got through a little bit of it, but
nothing really new. Like I only watched like 5 minutes. I need to really go through the whole thing to give James Jesso like credit on that. But really, you know, it's the standard critiques, and it's not really like, I guess for me, I'm hungry for strong arguments. And it's more like just saying things like intellectual property is bad. You know, I used to be a pretty hardcore intellectual property anarchist. Like IP is the thing holding us back, when in fact, like without incentive structures, like without IP law, we're going to go at a much slower pace. And like an analogy that I don't really want to use, but I will anyway. It's like, okay, MAPS, nonprofit, you know, they've been at it for what, 20, 30 years or something. And, you know, we made a lot of progress. It's great. They did a lot of that foundational work, but look how fast Compass and Field Trip are going, and you know, MindMed, Atai Life Sciences. Like,
I also wonder too about the landscape changing.
That's important to keep in mind. But you know, they broke ground, but still, USONA is going pretty slow too. Like, and they're a nonprofit. Like, nothing against MAPS or USONA. Like, I love you guys, but you know, we have to compare and contrast. Like, is capital always bad? Like, if we have people throwing money at these companies because there's going to be, you know, new innovative quote unquote medicine available and it saves a lot of lives, like, is that a net good? Like, it saves lives sooner than waiting another 30 years for the next drug to come online.
Right.
And another thing I saw in there, like, it's a really important point. I forget the lady's name. I wish I remembered, but it was something along the lines of people who, like, the psychedelic world needs people who are like confidential mediators, conflict resolution people, and that those people need to be paid for their time and services. I was like, cool, yeah, totally agree. Like, what do you propose? Like, there's no real proposal for how to do this or action, it seems like. Like the North Star Pledge and like the groups surrounding that, I think, are trying. But I haven't seen any real action yet against anybody or like trying to mediate, you know, claims. I just see kind of unbridled chaos often. And I'm like, okay, yes, we need professionals in there, but how do we do that? How do we fund these organizations? And as soon as you say, how do we fund these organizations, that implies capitalism.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I always think like, how are we funding our thing? You know, it's like a little bit of
selling courses
here
online.
and there.
Like, people are thankfully being patrons and giving us some money on Patreon. And, like, you know, still don't have health insurance. You know, went through most of 2020 without health insurance. So it's a little scary. I'm probably going to have to get it really soon so I don't like break a leg and have to pay for it straight cash. But
I guess it brings up the quality or the question of like, you know, if it was bringing in more money at times, could we do things that bring value to people versus like, you know, doing it out of passion, which is awesome. I mean, this started off as a passion project, right? I mean, we weren't really thinking about.
Yeah, I was deep in my software career. I had no hope that this would be a real thing at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. But the more time you spend, the more resources and time you spend on a project and the more passionate you get about it and it's not bringing it in, you know, that also creates, you know, hardship in your life. And, you know, can I pay my rent? This thing is really exciting and I want it to grow and blossom, but I can't really afford things. You know, I got to go get a full-time job and then maybe not be able to, you know, support the mission of psychedelics today. Right. So it's this double-edged sword where it's like, hey, we want to keep the passion and integrity, but also, we can't make this really work at times.
I think I saw this from Riley Capps on Twitter yesterday. It's pretty funny. Something like, my dealer was talking about these $2,000 grams of psilocybin. He's like, that's cool and everything, but it's just really not for me. I'm going to do these like $35 or $25 bags of mushrooms instead. It's like, yeah, like you can just say, not for me. Like you have the option to opt out. It's perhaps an elitist thing to say, but it, costs what? Less than $100 to grow mushrooms.
So I think this is like the ugly side of capitalism, right? Like it creates the wealth disparity and wealth gap, and then like more resources, people that have wealth gain more wealth.
Totally.
Like poor people aren't investing, or people that don't have money aren't investing, and then they don't have their money working for them. So, I mean, then you get caught up in that game, and it's like, well, the people on top are always going to win because they have the wealth that just keeps ticking while everybody else is on the bottom struggling. Right. And, I think that's the ugly extreme side of capitalism. But could we find like another way forward where I think parts of capitalism breed innovation and they breed opportunity to be able to like just start a business, right? Get out there and
where would computers be without IP? Like, thank you, Bill Gates and Microsoft. Like you've been a pain in the ass here and there, but you've done an incredible amount of good. I can't really complain. Like, I'm sure there are ethical violations all over the place, but that's kind of what happens when you get at a certain scale. But I'm thankful that Microsoft exists. Same thing with IBM, even though they worked with the Nazis way back. Mm-hmm. Like I'm still thankful for IBM giving us the platform, like the hardware platform to run Microsoft on. Yeah. Like the problem is we want to minimize everything to like soundbite politics. And this is more, we need to really read more. We need to like talk to each other more and not just throw like, I'm with her, like change we can believe in. It's like, well, what the fuck? No, like these people are like, I'll leak a little bit of my political bullshit, but how many of the past, 20 presidents could be considered war criminals at like an international court? Like that's a question that I always bring up for myself. It's like, I liked Obama a lot more than I like Big Orange, but still a war criminal. In fact, Trump might be less of a war criminal in some ways, also more of a war criminal in other ways. Like the stuff he's done domestically was not pretty. So like, the complicated as fuck arguments and, just blindly following your side, not challenging your uncomfortable things, like is a big deal. I don't know how you play with that. Like maybe just challenging your own taboos pretty regularly. Right. Like, I don't know. Is that ever discussed in therapy? Like helping people challenge their own taboos about like actions or behaviors or thoughts?
Yeah, all the time. Right.
Like, I don't want to tell my parents I'm gay, but I'm going to do it after I make like a strategic plan and feel safe enough to do it. Right.
Yeah.
Like, and that feels wildly unsafe, but you did it anyway. Mm-hmm. Like, I think one of the best things we've got in America is intellectual freedom in a lot of ways. And, free speech. Some countries you don't have that. You can go to jail pretty easily. And, not most countries, but some.
Yeah.
And, like we should be taking up that liberty and using it pretty regularly so we can, critique George Goldsmith, critique like companies coming into the psychedelic space that just look like kind of, pump and dump schemes or, whatever's going on there. Like we should be able to look at situations and have an idea what's going on. Like a lot of folks want to just use psychedelics and escape the world, like the dropout thing. Like I'm just going to be with the spirit world, but it's like, what good is you being with the spirit world if you're not having like any impact on the world, like this physical thing?
Yeah, just thinking about the psychedelic space and like companies coming in and just thinking about like the extreme of capitalism, seeing people with like, huge amounts of resources and just able to come in and play a game while there's been people really working their ass off. And I know we've talked about this in the past, like really sacrificing so much and, could be in really great positions of, to be able to really carry out this work with a lot of integrity, but then just get swept up by people that may not have any experience. They just have a lot of capital to throw at it. And it's kind of just like a game. They're like, oh, this is like a good investment and it's going to be a booming market. And they have no experience or like, or maybe it's a very new experience versus people that have been like, blood, sweat, and tears for years and decades that just kind of get swept under the rug. And, I think that's really a really challenging part of capitalism.
Bia Labate is a good example of this, right? Like, how many decades has she been at it?
Oh my God, yeah.
And people give her a really hard time. I don't think it's warranted. And
she's contributed a lot too.
Tremendous amount.
Just thinking about what they do at Chacruna, they're always pumping out really great webinar series. I mean, all the scholarly articles and books. I mean, it's really contributing to the field in so many different ways, and probably not making much money out of it versus somebody else coming in and just we have like a couple million to play with, and we'll just start up this company, and we don't really have any tradition or tied with this field, and but it's just a game. We can just come in, play, change people's lives. But on the other side, right, it's like, well, those people are going to scale and hopefully serve a lot of people. And isn't that, has that been the goal for most people in the psychedelic community? Like, how do we get these medicines more accessible? On the one side, it's going to be inaccessible. But maybe over time, as these models start to come out, it starts to become more accessible. So I don't know. It's, these weird double-edged swords of... I don't know. Come back to what's good, right?
What is the good? And I like to go look at. So if we look at this through the medical lens, we can safely call it a technology. If we use other lenses, we'd have to use other terms like technologies of the sacred or something goofy like that. But how do we comfortably look at this stuff and understand that this is part of our normal kind of evolution as a culture? Like, the first person that had a wheel probably made the second wheel pretty expensive, or like the printing press, or, Microsoft, for instance. Like, when Windows came out, it wasn't super cheap. Over time, it became a lot cheaper. Right. Software is probably not the best analogy. It's more hardware. Like, the first supercomputers, like the computer on like the first space shuttle, were enormous and wildly expensive, like many millions of dollars. And like your smartphone is hopefully less than $1,000, hopefully. And it does way more than that space shuttle's computer ever could. And, this is what's happening. Like, wheat probably used to cost a lot, cost barely a thing here in the States, partly because of technology, partly because of weird subsidies. But, like there's a trend with technology where things just keep becoming cheaper. Especially with innovation.
And then on the flip side, though, I think, one of the other critiques is that these are very sacred medicines, right? And do you commodify it to some extent, commodifying the sacred?
Well, let's dig into that. So psilocybin, coming from mushrooms, very sacred substance for a few different people. Same thing with peyote, same thing with ayahuasca, and a few others, iboga. Like, hugely sacred. Sasha Shulgin comes in with his money from DuPont, or wherever he made his killing, and started developing all sorts of new molecules that he freely published. Like, at what point does a molecule become not sacred? A term I heard the other day, or a phrase, was what is sacred other than significant? Like a code word for significance. And I think that's it's a pretty serious question to be asking. Yeah. So like 2CB, for instance, derivative of mescaline-ish. Like, what do we do with that? What do we do with MDMA and LSD?
Right.
I don't know. Like, what's your first impression there?
Well, I guess, nobody's really, I guess they're synthesizing psilocybin out of mushrooms. I think the argument on the one side is that, you have indigenous people that have kind of their IP and to some extent, and we're just kind of going in, extracting that information, creating it, not giving back, and maybe viewing it as our own, when really, we learned from a lot of these traditions in many different ways. And so, on that side, going in, extracting information, and maybe how to use these substances, creating them into a product, generating massive amounts of wealth with that, versus these people continue to struggle. Like in one of the articles published on Chacruna a while ago, talking about Maria Sabina, it was like she ultimately, she grew up in poverty and ultimately died in poverty, while now all of a sudden people are making money with this, right?
So Mark Plotkin and groups like him, like he runs the Amazon conservation team. They're working on schemes where they figure out how to get tribal groups involved in the IP of these projects.
Nice.
So they're actually working on schemes to help with that. Because like, how many more drugs are in the Amazon rainforest right now that we don't even know about? The answer is a gazillion. Like, there's so many drugs that could be helpful for the world that we don't even know about yet. And like, how do we, like, a lot of corporations will just go in, they don't give a shit. Like, that's most of human history, honestly. Like, this idea of IP and justice in this sense is like very new.
Right.
So there are people working on it outside of the psychedelic space. And maybe that's what the psychedelic space isn't doing well, is comparing what we do in the psychedelic space to other worlds. Like, you know, just go talk to an Amazon conservation person like Mark Plotkin and you go, oh, like, yeah, you're doing some really cool stuff. Like, this is this could be a model that could be replicated all over the place. Yeah. And, you know, realistically, if you're exclusively trying to make money and there's no real mission beyond that, like, of course you're going to cut corners. Like, if you, like, the modern world doesn't have a good agreement on ethics. Like, we want to think everybody's a humanitarian and, like, you know, post-Christian humanitarian, but it's not true. Like, it's really not true, especially when you're looking at some of these, like, hyper wealthy people. Like, you look at, you know, dictators doing really nasty stuff, like that guy that was killing drug offenders, Duarte or something.
Philippines.
Yeah. It's like gnarly. And yeah, like, we've got people that don't have that same ethic out there in the world. You know, on one hand, the United Nations is amazing. On the other hand, it's incredibly weak. It has zero teeth. Yeah. So weird, really complex and strange stuff that, you know, we've got to think about. And it was good that you raised that point, Kyle. Like, how do we figure out an appropriate way to help?
Yeah.
Like, we've talked about this before, like quinoa.
Yeah.
From Peru. Like, people in Peru are having a really hard time financially, not necessarily getting enough food or medicine or clothing or education for their kids.
It's like,
now an export. Like, you can ship around this stuff to the rest of the world. The problem being, like, okay, now you're buying McDonald's and whatnot with that money, and there's an increase in diabetes and people are getting overweight. But, you know, it's a really complicated thing to say, like, okay, me as a, you know, white American should say, okay, it's unethical for us to be buying quinoa from them, even though they want to sell it to us so that they can, quote unquote, improve their lives.
Right. And I guess the one argument I heard, I don't know how true this is, I would have to fact check it and look it up, but on the quinoa argument, here's an essential grain and now it's unaffordable for people because of how much it's in demand and how much they export out of those countries. So, you know, something that essentially didn't cost much and was like an essential part of their diet now can be very expensive for the people that use it. And I think that's also one of the concerns, right? Like,
but can they afford other stuff? And like, them as a people, them as a democracy, you know, theoretically, neoliberalism, it's hard to say what's a democracy and what isn't. Like, they as a people decided it was okay to do this. Mm-hmm. They could vote against it, but now they have access to cheaper foods from a global market. And
I was listening to the podcast with Eamon Armstrong and Ronan, yeah. And there was an argument about just kind of like all this stuff. And I think the one argument that was kind of interesting was about like going down into these you know, cultures. Say, like, I think the argument was about Coca-Cola, bringing Coca-Cola to, you know, indigenous people, and like it. Who is to say that they actually don't want, like, they don't want that or they want that, right? And to say from our perspective, that's a bad thing because we're introducing them to like our Western, like, you know, sugar addiction, and it's bad for the health. But on the flip side, is that also something that they want, right? And who's to say what's right? So the quinoa thing, it's like, you know, the people having those farms and exporting, is that something that they want to do because they're making money? Or, you know, on our side, maybe, you know, sometimes we view that as they can't get the essential grain that, you know, is part of their culture. I don't know.
Right. Like, just being hubristic enough to say that I have an answer, that's where I see the problem. Being willing to engage in conversation with people with a lot more experience with this kind of thing is probably where it's at. Like, okay, like, let's talk to 4 or 5 economists and see what their opinion is. Like, maybe talk to some professional ethicists, see what their opinion is. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think anybody is going to have the answer. But by hearing all those perspectives, we can learn more.
Yeah.
And we can apply this easily to the psychedelic world, exporting ayahuasca, for instance, from Peru, same country. Like, what does it mean that it's growing in Hawaii and all over the world and people have like included it now in their culture?
Right.
Like, there's all sorts of new cultures that this is an essential part of now.
Mm-hmm. So I guess on this topic of like psychedelic and capitalism and like maybe seeing there aren't strong arguments or maybe different models, have you thought about like a way to like a new model, a new way forward if you haven't been seeing these strong arguments?
Something I struggle with all the time. I think this is why I love permaculture so much, because it's like design focused thinking. Like you can apply permaculture to like anything from like, the layout of your bedroom to a full country and how it does its international trade. And Bennett Zellner, his episode comes out on Tuesday, actually, like just 4 or 5 days after this comes out. So like that's a really good one. Talks about like pollinator model economics. Like I think that's pretty cool, but it's like really underdeveloped. Like he's done a lot of good work. It's just not really, there's not enough there yet to really spread that. The Mondragon model in Portugal, I think is really cool, where like there's a cap on how much the executives make. It's like, a certain number over what the lowest paid employee gets. So it's kind of like a co-op in that way. Like as the company does better, the people do better. Like I see corporations incentivizing employees all the time like that. Like when I was in software, if the company did really well, you got a big check. Sometimes it was less than you wanted. Sometimes it was way more than you thought they were willing to give up, and it's all based on how well the company does. So like there's ways of doing profit sharing. There's ways of doing triple bottom line thinking. I think triple bottom line thinking, like, or business stuff, is a start. It's not perfect, but it's like, okay, how many trees did you plant this year? Okay, let's try to aim to do better. Like how many acres of, wetlands did you put back into conservation that can't be developed? Or like, I just drove through a weird part of, I forget if this is in Utah. I think it is, but Bears Ears is this area that's sacred to many tribes in that kind of desert area, like Navajo, Hopi, that kind of stuff. And the feds are trying to develop it, like take it out of protection so they can do like fracking and whatnot down there. I'm probably wrong on the particulars, but Patagonia is spending a shitload of money to publicize this and politicize it so that it can stay in conservation. Like it's a really big area for outdoor recreation too. Like, so not only is it sacred to native folks, it's sacred to people who find outdoors sacred.
Right.
And, they're a huge corporation and they're doing it, in my opinion, quite right. Like the CEO even says, buy used clothes. Like if you can find it used, buy that. Like do not be buying new stuff. Like there's a really serious problem on the planet.
Yeah. So how does, I guess, like some of these big corporations give back in a sense, and not just for like a PR stunt, but just actually caring about, the world?
And I don't want to apologize for billionaires, but Bill Gates and many others have done this billionaires pledge where they want to give away at least half of their net worth by the time they're dead. And perhaps have even more of it in like, funds to help, betterment of the world. Again, like this humanistic ethos, like is an impulse that people keep coming back to. And I'm, thankful for that, because I think there's going to be a lot of spending on conservation and innovation around environmental stuff in the near future.
I just think about, I guess, flow and stagnation, like when people are just like hoarding energy and it's not flowing. And I guess that probably comes out of like sacred economics, right? I think
it's like traditional Chinese medicine applying energy flow to the stuff. I never read Eisenstein, but I'm peripheral enough to his work that I kind of get the gist.
Yeah. Instead of just like hoarding that, how does it come in and then flows back into the community, right? Like you're providing a service that is good for somebody wants that thing, but you're also kind of giving back in different ways and just not hoarding that energy or that whatever that material wealth is, right?
Right.
And so maybe it's just our relationship with money and how we hoard things, hoard material wealth. We just want to buy a lot of stuff instead of thinking about like, how do we help each other out? And how can you get maybe more in that like flow idea versus like, I need to save this.
Eisenstein's critique was often about like interest and like, so it's about interest and inflation, deflation. So he was always proposing like a deflationary money. So like the longer you hold it, the less valuable it is. So you actually have incentive to spend it. And in our current situation, we have incentive to hoard.
Hoard, yeah.
Because it's not like wheat, where wheat used to go bad in the silos if you didn't like get rid of it.
Right.
So yeah, like we've got a lot of revolutionizing to do. Like when I was doing my Evolver reality sandwich stuff way back 10 years ago, my line was full systems change. Like every system we have in place right now is kind of sick. If not, I think
we're
sick.
Seeing that, right? I mean, COVID has kind of pumped the brakes on everything, and now we're starting to get like we're able to observe some of those weak points and be like, whoa, this is not working.
Right. Like what is late January going to look like when the landlords now have the ability to evict everybody? There's going to be a lot of homeless people and a lot of really angry, politically active people, which is great, in one sense. Like it's great that people are going to be active, but I just, I hope the energy goes in the right direction. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I guess maybe we beat this stuff up enough. I really want to talk about this book if we got time.
Yeah, I think we have 5 or so minutes.
All right.
7 minutes.
I'll try to do it quick. So this book is called Chaos: Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neill and Dan Piepenbring. I think Piepenbring, something like that. Anyway, this book, I heard about it listening to this guy who'll be on the show soon on Rogan. He's a professor out of Emory in Georgia, talking about like sex, death, drugs, and music. It's like, oh, cool. Like, you're probably the coolest professor ever. And this book came up in the middle of the talk, and Rogan's just going on a rant. And I was like, I think I need to buy that immediately. So we paused the interview and bought the book right away, and got to listen to it on this road trip. And essentially, it shows pretty damning evidence in both testimony, discrepancy in all sorts of cases, like sworn oaths in the courtroom. And those same individuals totally changing their story for newspapers downstream, and missing police reports, timelines being all broken for when certain breaks in the case were found, and this whole helter-skelter motive being kind of a fabrication for the Tate Bianca murders. This is the stuff that happened at Roman Polanski's house in LA. A bunch of people got murdered there, including a pregnant woman. And they kind of played around with this in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the recent, who's that guy?
I think, who is in there? Brad Pitt?
Well, Brad Pitt and Leo, but the director, he's famous for gore, Kill Bill.
Tarantino?
Yeah, it was a Tarantino film, so it was a little crazy, but I think you need Tarantino to do the Manson story. Anyway, it played on a lot of this stuff, showed a lot of scenes that are really important to the story. But really, this guy shows pretty clearly that the main prosecutor, Bugliosi, was pretty corrupt, and then goes into detail in one chapter just to set the stage. Hey, I'm not a paranoid monster. Here's all the evidence I found on MKUltra, Operation Phoenix, which was nightmare factory in Vietnam. They were doing really bad stuff in Vietnam, definitely war crime stuff, and it was approved by Nixon. So now I have an even better reason to not like Nixon. So, and how often the drug war was just an extension of the paranoia of communism being able to, topple America and capitalism. So it's this deep-seated fear of the U.S.S.R. So the U.S.S.R. is really powerful, really scary. Wasn't a pretty scene, the relationship between the states and the Soviets. And that paranoia leaked into everywhere, from the presidency to the CIA to everything. And the LSD thing and the drug war was just a convenient, not necessarily convenient, but maybe a logical consequence of that paranoia. And and they used Manson. It was pretty clear they used Manson as hey, look, he looks just like you hippies, except he's got an X on his head. This is what the hippie American has underneath the hood. Any hippie American could turn into Manson.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And he was the thing they used to end the 60s in a lot of ways. Hey, LSD is not that great. Look, Manson happened. There's a lot of other factors.
Well, that's something that we brought up a few times too, right?
Yeah. But there's a lot of factors at play here. It's not one thing. Lenny keeps saying, it was to push against the anti-war movement. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And, I think that's what history always tells us, is the story is more complicated than we want to give it credit for.
Right.
So anyway, I think people should buy this book, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. I'd love to get the author on, but I think he's in his 80s. I'm not too sure if he's doing interviews, but I'll see what I can do.
And this was just published in 2019.
Yeah,
so
it's
not
just
too
the
long
last year.
ago.
He spent 20 years obsessed doing work on this. Like, pretty much put everything else on hold and researched this, like, nonstop. Had to deal with all the kooks surrounding the whole scene. Like, was able to interview, because he's been on it for so long, he's able to interview a lot of the players who are in this whole, like, mix up of intelligence officers and spies and everything. Like, it's fucking wild. Anyway, I think that's it for now. I do want to remind everybody that we've got Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists starting up in January. I think it's January 7. It'll be on Thursdays. We've got 2 time slots. We'll give it in U.S. Eastern, if I can do that. 2 and 7.
PM. Yep.
2 and 7 Eastern U.S. time. So compatible for folks in the UK and Europe, and also for some folks in Australia that don't mind waking up a little early to join us. And it's 8 weeks of live supported classes with Kyle and I, supported by a ton of mastered classes from various experts in the field. It's CE approved in the state of California for psychologists, therapists, and nurses, and that is highly transferable, but make sure you check with your licensing board before you jump in. And we do give out some certificates. This isn't a class that says, all right, 8 weeks with Joe and Kyle, now you can go facilitate drug sessions with people. That's not what this is. This is more like a foundations class, and like an overview of everything that's going on in this space, from the legal to the therapeutic to the religious, and much more. Anything you want to add there?
No, if you want to sign up, you can check that out at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And classroom time, we can get a little nuanced on the topics and really dig deep. So it's just a really great opportunity to come in, ask questions, and get a little nuanced on some of these topics.
Modeling what they do at some higher level institutions like Harvard. You like do the reading, then you come in to discuss it, other than just getting like lectured at, which kind of wastes class time often. As opposed
That's how
to
my undergrad was.
It was all lecture or all conversational?
Conversational. They'd have you do all the work beforehand, and then come into class. And my class sizes were like 5, maybe 5 to 10 people, and we just sit around and pretty much talk about everything. So if you didn't do your work, it actually challenged you to do your work, because you're like, I don't want to show up to class and be that idiot not having anything. I want to
participate. And like, participation in the material is how you really get to know the material.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you, Kyle, and thank you all for listening. Yeah. We'll see you in a few more days with Bennett Zellner, and I think you're going to like that one. So thank you all for tuning in, and Joe and Kyle signing off. Take care, everybody.
Take care.